Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Delta Report. And this is going to be a Delta Report show. Not about Bitcoin, but about something else, something much more uh, insidious. To understand it, you have to go back into the 1930s, in America in the 1930s, which is what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about the Great Trap. And, some of you out there are perking up and you realize what I'm talking about. Not completely, but you're going to see it from my perspective. And you might have your own perspective on it. And I'm also going to talk about at the end of this show how we get out of the Great Trap. The Great Trap was basically laid and started the groundwork for it was being laid when they created the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve Act back around I think it was 1914. Anyway, the Federal Reserve is what caused the Great Depression. A lot of people don't know this. Money was pumped into the stock market. Does that sound familiar? The stock market fell big time, and then the Great Depression come in the 1930s. And, what happened was an awful lot of people found it very hard. The same things happened back then as happening today, but that's not the Great Trap. The Great Trap is our ability to take care of ourselves. If you went back to the 1930s, an awful lot of people back then did not have electricity. They certainly didn't have the internet, and they weren't near as reliant upon it. People escaped the cities back then by riding the rails. Riding the trains back then, a lot of them were still steam. And, if a train ran out of fuel back in those days, they could quite literally, well, they carried the fuel in a fuel car, which was a car full of coal. And they had a guy shovel the coal into the steam boiler, which would make the train move down the track. Quite literally, if they ran out of coal, they could quite literally go into the woods and actually get that train moving just by using deadfall and old trees and stuff that they could throw in. And there was lots of woods on the side of the train track, so they could get out of a pinch that way, ordinarily they didn't do it. But what do we got today? We got much fewer trains. Back then they used to have an extensive network of train systems across America. They had tracks going much more places than they do now back then. That system that they had was much more capable of handling problems than what we have. I'll put it that way. They've since removed an awful lot of the rail lines. You see the abandoned rail lines all across the United States of America. And now the trains that they do have run on diesel fuel. And, it's very likely that they've connected them in so that the internet has to be up and running to operate the switches that move the train from one track to another, And so if the internet was down across the entire country, the trains probably wouldn't be able to move. That's the kind of system we've created for ourselves. But in those days, they used to have a hand thing that the guy could go and pull it to switch the train from one track to another. It wasn't all electronic like it is now. We've done that entirely through the system, and this is what the trap is. The trap is we've went in all hog. We haven't stopped and said, hey, what would happen if we had some sort of an emergency? We've went in all hog for these new modern conveniences and everything else. New complete reliance upon the internet, and this is what the trap is. I'll give you for instance, our stores back in the 1930s had an awful lot of mom and pop stores out in the country stores. And I mean, this is kind of like nostalgic for us today, a country store where they carry different things like flour and sugar and everything. They have the pot-bellied stove in the middle of the store, and it's only a small store, and of course they have windows in the front, light comes in through the windows, and it's more of a local family business, family owned and operated, And they used to have them dotted all the way across America. So if you had a big power outage or something like that, you could still go in and buy stuff using physical money. They would take quarters, dimes, nickels, and they had the old-fashioned cash register where they pull the handle down, it goes ka-ching, and it opens up and they do the transaction. No power required. That type of a system is very resilient to problems happening in the country. So if the power grid goes down, no problem. They can still serve customers. And the light can come in through the front of the windows of the store. It's self-sufficiency at its finest. What do we have today? Walmart Supercenter. No windows. All the food is distributed from that one big store, and all of the other stores, basically a lot of them have closed down. Because they can provide the service of supplying food to the people much cheaper than everyone else. You still have a small amount of these other stores, but a lot of them are going out of business to the big super chains fast. So we're moving into a system that doesn't have any redundant systems in place in case of an emergency. And this system that we've got set up for ourselves, it seems to function rather well. But it's a trap. It's a trap in the sense that if it breaks down, the whole thing breaks down suddenly, and then it doesn't function at all. And this is why it's a trap. Back in the 1930s, when they had the Great Depression, a lot of people left the cities and they went out into the country, where there were small farms. Now, by today's standards, these small farms would be what we would call off-grid, because they didn't have a grid back then, basically. A lot of these farms didn't have electricity. They're very self-sufficient. A lot of the tools they used on the farms were cast-iron tools that they had bought, like hay baling machines, that would run off of a horse. And they were cast iron, so they would last forever. They didn't plug them in or anything like that. Didn't have an engine on them or anything like that. They just worked off of the power the wheel would turn. When the wheel would turn, it would start baling the hay, and it would operate off the horsepower when the horse pulled it. Stuff like that. Sometimes, in some cases, they had treadmills where the horse would walk on a treadmill to operate a machine. And you have 1 horsepower there. And then they'd use that. They might have a belt or a chain drive, and the whole thing was cast iron. Easy to repair. We've exchanged all that out. We've swapped all of that out for big combine farms and stuff, where everybody goes into work, and if they get one case of the disease we got going around now, the whole farm will close down, and then the production stops. What we've done is we've made ourselves vulnerable. This is the trap. And so what we've all done is picture it in your mind like a trap, and we're a bunch of squirrels, and we went inside this big steel cage trap, and now the door is just slammed shut. And we didn't see the trap because we were so interested in our modern way of life, our modern lifestyle with our Netflix and we're so absorbed in our telephones and I've been warning about this for years, that we don't have any redundant systems in place. And the cities are the most vulnerable. If we get some sort of a problem where the system starts to actually go down because people are discontented, then bigger problems can arise than what we have right now. We're already partially into a very destructive period, equal to or not greater than the Great Depression. But what's happened was we've come from a good, strong economy where we had a high amount of production and everything else, and this has struck so suddenly that there's a carryover effect. where it's like Wile E. Coyote when he goes out over the cliff, and he stays there for a second before he falls. We're in that period where we're hanging on thin air right now. And everything's getting ready to cascade down. It's already happened. It's too late now at this point. And so where the trap comes in is because we've created this entire system that has all these interdependencies. So, like your trucking firms across America, that carry the food to the grocery stores and stuff. They're reliant upon the fuel that they can get and also the banking system staying together, and a lot of them have big extended loans out on their trucks, not only on their trucks but on the whole they make their pay off of the bank. The bank has what they call a floor plan for their business or whatever, and the bank extends them credit, and if credit starts to dry up, then they can't make payroll, and they can't buy the next batch of fuel to get the groceries to the grocery stores in the first place. Now, if the people don't get the groceries to the grocery stores, when people start to go hungry, there's a time clock then starts. It's like a countdown when people actually do run out of food. Now, the other night, I was sitting there watching the news, and I saw these big, long lineups going to food banks in the United States. And, they were opening up people's trunks and putting in boxes and boxes and crates of food in each car. And then the car would drive off, and then the next car would come in, and they would put all this food in. They had the food all sitting there in the center of the road, big stacks of tomatoes and big stacks of boxes of this and boxes of that and everything else. Food aplenty. This is part of what's been keeping the system going now, is this food aplenty that's being delivered to people who have no food. People are traveling, and gas is cheap right now, and they can travel considerable distance still in their cars. And this system that we have running right now could be maintained for a while by the $1,200 checks that are coming from the government, and the food banks supplying them with food, and they can go home and they can watch Netflix, while they try to stay inside and avoid the virus. And so this can go on for an extended period of time without any real turmoil beginning. But there's going to come a point in the future where they're way behind in their rent. They haven't paid for, like, say, the last 3-4 months. I'm talking about in the future, where they haven't paid for a while because they're out of work. And all of a sudden, these food banks out there, they run out of food. This food that they're trucking into these food banks is coming from someplace. And the thought went through my head, when I saw all these people in line waiting to get their food at the food banks and stuff. The thought went through my head is, what if all these food banks across America suddenly they just run out? Well, that's when the real crisis is going to begin. People during the Great Depression, they just didn't stay where they were. When they start to run out of food, and they start to run out of jobs, and they start to run out of options, well, things happen. Things like mass migrations and things can happen. Let's turn the charts on right here and take a look at some of this stuff. Lesson 10 from the Great Depression. It said mass migration was common. Mass migrations, a physical rearrangement or a shuffling of the demographics of America, like they shuffled the demographics of America like a professional blackjack dealer. The Great Depression, an era of movement and vagrancy, a time where jobs were sought out by adventurers who hopped on trains from one town to the next or walked on the roads and hitchhiked when they could. Caravan loads of migrants moved westward from the east toward a new life in California. John Steinbeck described the migrations impeccably well in his 1939 novel, The Grapes of Wrath. And then the depossessed were drawn west from Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, and Nevada, and Arkansas. Families, tribes dusted out, tractored out, carloads, caravans, homeless and hungry. 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, and 200,000 of them. They streamed over the mountains, hungry and restless, restless as ants, scurrying to find work to do, to lift, to push, to pick, to cut, anything, any burden to bear for food. The kids are hungry. We have no place to live, like ants scurrying for work, for food, and most of all for land. When local prospects are nil, you must move to survive. If you would prefer to avoid such a fate, then focus on your families and self-reliance. If you can, thrive where you are. Well, I'm going to tell you what. Today's age is entirely different. Those people that were migrating back during the Great Depression, they weren't on Valium, they weren't on all these different drugs, they weren't on all these different meds. They were stronger and a healthier generation than we have now. Now, half of the population now is mentally unstable, and not only that. When we're talking about population in general, the country now is so much more fuller of people. There's so many more people, you know. We're facing an unprecedented crisis here that is developing, and it hasn't really expressed itself yet. I would almost call it like the calm before the storm. Let's take a look at this. The Great Depression hits farms and cities in the 1930s. Farmers struggled with low prices all through the 1920s. But after 1929, things began to be hard for city workers as well. After the stock market crash, many businesses started to close. Does that sound familiar to what we're happening now? Or lay off workers. Does that sound familiar? Many families did not have money to buy things, and customer demand for manufacturing goods fell off. So the same thing's going to happen now. Manufactured goods, people just aren't going to be able to afford them. They do not have money. It says fewer families were buying new cars or household appliances. Same thing's going to happen again. People learned to do without new clothing. Many families could not pay their rent. Does that sound familiar? Some young men left home by jumping on railroad cars and searching for any job that they could get. Some wondered if the United States was heading into a revolution. Some people wondered if the United States was heading for a revolution. It says during World War I, farmers worked hard to produce record crops and livestock. When prices fell, they tried to produce even more to pay off their debts, taxes, and living expenses. In the early 1930s, prices dropped so low that many farmers went bankrupt and lost their farms. In some cases, the price of a bushel of corn fell to just 8 or 10 cents. Some farm families began burning corn rather than coal for their stoves because corn was cheaper. And we see the exact same thing happening now. Food being dumped and stuff, on one side of the coin. And on the other side of the coin, people starting to go hungry. And so what we have is a situation where the system is not functioning properly. And this is all part of the trap. Except back during the 1930s, during the Great Depression era, it was something where people could cope better. I think what's going to happen this time is there's going to be less avenues out. And so back in those days, the small farms, there was many small farms dotting the countryside, that were very self-sufficient, and people could leave the cities, go on those small farms, and this was what made the movie, Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz, which is a classic, a favorite, and an awful lot of people, probably a lot of you've watched the movie. In the early part of the movie, you had the 3 farm workers who were working on the farm for old Aunt, I forget what her name was, Dorothy's aunt, Aunt B or something like that. I can't remember what her name was. Anyway, she had taken those guys on as farmhands, but those were guys who had left the city, walked out there, found the farm, needed a place to work, and she probably let them sleep in the barn, and she gave them something to eat, and they were basically working for food on a small farm. Times aren't like that anymore. Now, for every one of those guys that went out in the country back then with a knapsack on his back looking for work or whatever, now there'd be 100 for every one of those, and they wouldn't be so peaceful as they were back then. Back then, they were more like they would go in and knock on the door and say, "Is there any work I could have here?" or whatever. Nowadays, what we'd be looking at is more like a groups of angry, hungry mobs, and they wouldn't be peaceful. They would be, uh, would they be, the big question here I would ask is, would they be law-abiding? Probably not. So it would represent a huge problem for the people who are self-sufficient out there, who have tried to prepare for this coming economic shock, who have went off grid or whatever, small people who have prepared, this would be a huge problem, very problematic, especially if the power grid goes down for any extended period of time, and especially, if the telecommunications grid goes down with the power grid. We could be looking at a situation that's untenable for a period of time, and how long would that period last? Well, it's hard to say, but it could make what's happening with this virus, what we have, like in the United States of America, I think there's like 70,000 deaths right now with the virus, which is terrible, and I'm not underestimating I'm not making light of the amount of horrible things that's happened from this virus, killing 70,000 people and all the families out there are affected by that. But it would pale in comparison to what we would see if the power grid and the telecommunications grid went down for an extended period of time and the world went into a position of chaos where even the authorities and possibly even the military couldn't maintain control. And so there are people out there prepared for a situation like this, But the thing is have they really ran the scenario through their mind and figured how many people who haven't prepared that's going to get in their way, or basically cause problems for them, And this is a situation where what's happened with the virus with 70,000 people dying could be like a small speed bump compared to going over the Grand Canyon, basically. And so, am I saying that this is going to happen? No, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying that we're in the trap. We have to maintain the system that we've been given. We've all fell into this trap of putting our faith in a system that supports us using modern technology. And the system is like there's no redundant systems in place to protect us, and the system itself is vulnerable because what they've done is they've linked everything together. Like take the power grid, for instance. They haven't separated the power grid into areas where if one part of the grid goes down, another part stays on. They've created a power grid that's like if a huge area of the grid goes down, it's going to start to brown out other areas that they're not affected, that are nearby, because the power leaks through the grid. It's all connected like one circulatory system in the body, Like, in other words, if a person accidentally sticks his hand into a harvester or something and he loses a limb, well, his whole circulatory system is connected, so all the blood's going to drain out. And that's the way with the power grid. It's all interconnected. Now, the way it should have been arranged is each individual state in the United States should have had an individual power grid for just that particular state. That's not connected to the next state. Isolated. So that if one state goes out, only the power in that state goes out, and then the other states could come in and bring their power crews in and stuff and get the power back on again. Or at the very least, I mean, the same way with the telecommunications grid. The telecommunications grid should have had separate areas. They should have called them nodes. So one node for the East Coast, one node for, and then what would happen is then the nodes would communicate back and forth. But if one area went down, just that one node would go down instead of connecting the whole worldwide grid. And they've done this all the way through the entire system for everything. And it's all interdependent. So the trap is where all of this could leave us all high and dry with no water, no food, no communication, no power, and nobody would know what's going on. Or when anything would come back, because we'd have no telecommunications to tell us. And everybody who asked would know the same thing as you, nothing. They would just be like, well, I don't know, the power went out Wednesday. And you'd say, well, when's it going to come back on? They'd say, well, I don't know, do you know? They'd ask you. And you'd say, well, I don't know, ask Joe. And Joe, I don't know. And there's a police officer over there, ask him. He don't know either. Nobody knows. Well, what happened? Nobody knows what happened. And some people might be theorizing, saying, well, maybe we got attacked by an EMP, an electromagnetic pulse from space or something. Nobody would know. And confusion would enter into the world. Everybody would be wondering what's going on, but they would know one thing for certain, that they're thirsty and hungry. Now I'm going to tell you what, and why I say that this could be a much more desperate and much bigger situation than this virus, which has killed 70,000. If this were to be something that was spread over a wide area, everything's down, and nobody knows why, and nobody knows what's going on. After, you cannot survive for more than 72 hours without water, without fresh potable water. You cannot survive without food for more than 40 days. And that's why I say that this situation could be completely untenable. And it could bring about the demise of more people. It could make this flu look just like a speed bump. If this kind of a situation were to happen. And now, like I've said, I've pointed out to you now what the trap is. The trap is this interdependent system that we've created for ourselves. Now, I've also said at the end of this show, I'm going to explain to you how we get out of it. Okay? But the thing about it is now that we're all in it, we're all in this trap, and now that you can see this trap, the best thing for us all to do is not to panic. Because if we all panic, if everybody panics out there, because they haven't got jobs or whatever, and they say, oh, we're going to rise up or whatever because there's 20 million of us because we haven't got jobs or whatever. We're going to do this and we're going to do that. They don't realize that they're in a trap, and if they try to bring the system down or stuff, it's like we're all a bunch of squirrels inside the trap, and one of the squirrels decides he's going to do something that he can't get out of the trap because the trap's made of steel. And, if you can't get out, then everybody is going to suffer for what. See, because we're all locked in this trap together, if we create a problem that the system now goes down, and the power grid goes down, and the telecommunications goes down, and everything else, if we create a problem that causes that to happen, this is a steel trap that we're in. And we'll all suffer the effects of that. So, if we're going to get out of this steel trap, we got to do it carefully. We didn't get in this trap overnight. It's the same way. I know how to explain it to you guys. Pretend there was a woman who had uh, not ate properly for like 30 years. It took her 30 years to get that big, and she got up to like 800 pounds. And she can barely move. Well, she's in a trap. Her body is the trap at that point. She can't even get out of the bed to walk to the bathroom. And there's people like that. Believe it or not, there are people that's happened to them. You know, uh, she didn't get in that situation overnight. We are all like we're in that situation. We are just that helpless and just that dependent upon the system. She didn't get that way overnight. Now, if she jumps up in one day and decides, oh, I'm going to beat this thing, I'm going to do this and do that, and she goes out and tries to exercise too much, maybe her little heart will have a heart attack and she'll die right then and there on the spot. But if she works very slowly at it over a period of time and starts slowly losing the weight and not overdoing it, maybe exercising just a little bit, watching what she eats and is very careful, she starts to slowly lose the weight day after day, week after week, and she progresses at it. After a certain period of time, she might only weigh 200 pounds. And now she can get up and she can go to the gym or whatever, drive her car, do all these kind of things. Well, that's the same way with us. We didn't get in this trap overnight, and what we got to do is it's like trying to, don't panic when you're in quicksand. You'll sink under and you'll die. You can actually swim in quicksand. If you take a big air full of lungs, you don't panic, you fill your lungs full of air and slowly let your body float up to the surface. You can actually swim in quicksand. But you got to swim very slowly and conserve your energy, and you got to keep your lungs full of air, and you got to basically float your way across, and you can actually get out of quicksand that way, all by yourself. And we are like we're in quicksand right now, and we can get out of this trap. And the way to get out is each person out there. If you decide not to live in the city anymore, if you decide to buy a piece of land out in the country, and you decide to go off-grid, get yourself some pigs, get yourself some chickens, get yourself a few goats. Yes, you can keep the internet. Yes, you can keep the telecommunications. Yes, you can keep the power grid. But put in a system so you don't really need the power grid anymore. Maybe a solar system. Go and get some pigs. Go and get some. And if the more people that do that, it's going to move us away from this dependency on the system. And if we get enough people doing that, enough people out there becoming like ready to survive, whatever, then if the power grid goes down, the telecommunications network goes down and stuff, then we've got a way out. And that's what happened in the 1930s. There was enough of those small farms out there where it wasn't a complete total disaster. Because if it happens right now, like it did in the 1930s, it could be a complete total disaster now. What they were able to survive in the 1930s. So we're in this trap. We got to see the trap for what it is. And we got to plan ahead. And the more of us that actually start moving in that direction, and that's what I'm thinking in my mind, is to move in that direction. Because each one of us can do our part in moving in that direction to make the North American continent self-sufficient again, rather than relying totally 100% on the system to support us. And even the people that maybe you're a stockbroker or whatever, I don't know you can still think about doing that. To think about maybe moving out of the urban area and moving out into the country and making a small farm and getting some hogs, getting some chickens, getting some goats, and buy some old implements that hand implements, even shovels and rakes and hoe, to hoe the ground with, and maybe even getting yourself some sort of a plow that maybe runs off of an old Tecumseh engine or one of those old Briggs and Stratton engines, that's very reliable, and making a little farm and making it very self-sufficient for yourself, learning how to till the soil and plant things. and moving away from this trap. And as more and more people do that, in the end, we will get out of this trap. Thank you guys for listening. Like and subscribe, and we'll catch you guys in the next show. Bye-bye.